Welcome to a presentation from the Academic Writing Program at the University of Maryland. I'm Linda McCree, Director of Academic Writing, and today I'm going to offer an overview of Chapter 1 of Joseph Harris's book, Rewriting: How to Do Things with Texts. That chapter, titled Coming to Terms, offers excellent insights about critical reading and about conceiving of and writing a summary. If you've been assigned the reading, you'll find it helpful to have the chapter in front of you, but if you've not, I think you'll also find this presentation to be useful as you prepare to write a summary of an academic argument. In his introduction to rewriting, Joseph Harris says, "My aim in this book is to help you make interesting use of the texts you read in the essays you write." Harris's book then seeks to help you do something in your writing. He outlines a way to read critically, to engage sources, and effectively incorporate the ideas of others in your own writing. Those are also the things that you'll practice doing throughout the semester in English 101, beginning with the summary paper. In academic writing, your writing nearly always involves using texts in the essays that you write, so Harris's aim matches one of the aims of the course. In Chapter 1, Harris offers strategies that fulfill the title of the chapter. The suggestions help you to come to terms with complex texts so that you can understand them, use them to enrich your own ideas about a topic, and represent what they say in your own prose. In this presentation, I'll review some of Harris's main points in Chapter 1, focusing on how to apply his ideas to conceiving of and writing a good summary of an academic text. Harris tells us to make three basic moves in what he refers to as coming to terms with another text by another writer. These three are: define the project of the writer in your own terms, note keywords or passages in the text, and assess the uses and limits of this approach. Harris expands on each of these points in the chapter, so let's explore these points with a bit more depth. Regarding how we might define the project of a writer in his or her text, Harris brings up the idea of aims, methods, and materials, a trio of terms that will be very useful as you move toward writing your summary in English 101. In terms of aims, Harris asks us to ask the questions. What is a writer trying to achieve? What position does he or she want to argue? What issues or problems does he or she explore? In terms of methods, the questions include: how does a writer relate examples to ideas? How does he or she connect one claim to the next, build a sense of continuity and flow? And finally, about materials, Harris's questions are: where does the writer go for examples and evidence? What texts are cited and discussed? What experience or events are described? Harris employs an example from Carol Gilligan's summary of Sigmund Freud's theories in her books In a Different Voice to point out several key ideas about aims, methods, and materials. And so this is one of the quotations that Harris employs. This is from Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice. In 1914, with his essay on narcissism, Freud swallows his distaste of the thought of abandoning observation for barren theoretical controversy and extends his map of the psychological domain. Tracing the development of the capacity to love, which he equates with maturity and psychic health, he locates its origins in the contrast between love of the mother and love for the self. But in thus dividing the world between narcissism and object relationship, he finds that while men's development becomes clearer, women's becomes increasingly opaque. The problem arises because the contrast between mother and self yields two different images of relationships. Relying on the imagery of men's lives in charting the course of human growth, Freud is unable to trace in women the development of relationships, morality, or a clear sense of self. This difficulty of fitting the logic of his theory to women's experience leads him, in the end, to set women apart, marking their relationships, like their sexual life, as a dark continent for psychology. So what does Harris use this example to show us? First, one of the things that Harris notes about Gilligan is that even though she will disagree with Freud, Gilligan is generous and represents Freud fairly in her summary. To borrow from another English 101 reading, we might say, from They Say, I Say, Gilligan here represents what he says, what Freud says, quite fairly and ethically before she's going to establish her I say, what she says. So we might say that Harris's advice begins with the suggestion that we demonstrate a belief in your summary, or rather a belief in the text for the summary. The summary is the place to represent the author's ideas. Remember that analysis, synthesis, and argument come later. In summary, really the aim is to fairly represent the author's ideas. Harris also points out that the summary is all about the words of another, and that the other author's ideas need to be clear at the level of the sentence. Specifically, he notes that in the example from Carol Gilligan, Freud, the author she's discussing, is the subject or actor of nearly every one of her sentences. Let's take a look at how that looks in Gilligan's passage. So here's the passage from Gilligan again, and I've highlighted in red the way that Freud is the subject or the actor of her sentences. We can see a couple of things if you take a look at this. First of all, it's not that all of Gilligan's sentences begin in a very redundant way. Freud says, Freud thinks, Freud points out. Instead, what we see is that she's used more complex sentence development. And that, as Harris notes, Freud or his theories are either the actual actor or the subject of all of her sentences. This sentence-level style accomplishes several things. It makes it clear that the ideas are Freud's and not Gilligan's own, so there's no confusion for Gilligan's readers. And it also makes it evident that Gilligan is representing Freud here. She's not speaking for him, but letting him speak in her text. She will, as Harris lets us know, refute him later, but here she represents him ethically and clearly. So Harris's advice to make the other author the subject or actor of your sentences in a summary is both practical advice at the sentence level, like how do you construct your sentences, but also a theoretical approach to using the words of another. After considering how to define the project of the writer, let's move on to Harris's next point, which is noting keywords and passages. When you're writing a summary, it's a challenge to decide when you're going to quote directly from the original text and when you're going to paraphrase. Particularly if it's a source that's rich in information and ideas, it's easy to feel like the only way you can really represent it is, well, to repeat it. So how do you decide when to quote from a text in your summary or in any kind of reference? And again, Harris offers a few key ideas here. Harris points out that one mark of a strong academic writer is the ability to move from the global to the local, from projects to paraphrasings, from talking about a text as a whole to noticing moments of particular interest in it. Here he's suggesting that to really understand and explain a piece, you need to be able to move from understanding its broad project to the particular ways that project is constructed, understanding its key moments and concepts. Harris suggests that as a reader you can ground how you define the project of a writer by citing key passages from his or her text. This isn't necessarily a simple thing to do. One mark of an ineffective summary is often that many passages are quoted without making that move from displaying an understanding of the way the broad project is based on specifics. To write a more effective summary, Harris recommends light touches of quotation, that is, selectively quoting and doing so quoting sparingly, only when the passages quoted are really crucial to the understanding of the author's meaning and project. As a reader, trying to understand what a text you've just read means, that can be very difficult. And in the early stages of your draft, you're likely to select a lot of quotes, believing they're really crucial to understanding. But as your understanding of that text, the author's text develops, you'll be able to apply that lighter touch that Harris is talking about. Harris offers a little further advice here, noting later that in deciding when to quote, then, the question to ask is not, what is the writer of this text trying to say, but what aspects of this text stand out for me as a reader? And this is part of Harris's focus on interpretation, that anytime we read a text, we're also interpreting it. Not everything, obviously, can stand out, so paring down what we quote and really focusing on the aspects that stand out is a way of just addressing this problem of how much do I quote. Harris also puts it another way, one that you'll want to remember as you read, incorporate, and respond to sources in the construction of your own argument. He notes, summarize when what you have to say about a text is routine, and quote when it's more contentious. Quotations then, he goes on to say, can act as flashpoints in the text and thus stand out for their intensity. One more good piece of advice, another phrase to keep in mind, that notion of flashpoints. Further, he says, to quote only those phrases or passages that you want to do further work with or bring pressure upon, whose particular implications and resonances you want to analyze, elaborate, counter, revise, echo, or transform. That's his expansion of the notion of flashpoint. And then let's take a look at how, again, looking at the passage from Carol Gilligan, how Gilligan does this. So if we look at highlighting some different things from Gilligan, I've highlighted in red the places where Gilligan quotes Freud. And we can see that in her selection of what she's decided to quote, she's quoted with some frequency in this one paragraph. She's quoted 3 phrases or 2 phrases in a term. And we can see that those are places that she really wants to apply pressure to Freud's points. The rest we could consider as paraphrase, very honest paraphrase, but we can see that she's selected a handful of very important, what she clearly thinks are important points, and that she'll apply pressure on those later, using them as flashpoints. Harris's third point concerns assessing uses and limits of the writer's approach. The word assessing may be the source of some confusion here in thinking about a summary. An assessment is a judgment, and the summary assignment for English 101 specifically says that the summary should not be making an evaluative argument about the text. So how does Harris suggest that we assess? Well, for one thing, he says that we need to assess the method of the approach rather than the actual ideas. Reminding us that academic argument is rarely all or nothing, and that instead it assumes there's value in any perspective. Harris suggests that this assessment is more about how the writing makes the choices it makes about its evidence and ideas. He notes here, academics seldom write in an all or nothing mode, trying to convince readers to take one side or the other of an argument. Instead, their work assumes that any perspective on an issue, and there are often more than 2, will have moments of both insight and blindness. So he's kind of suggesting that academic writing in general already starts from that point of view of fairness and ethical treatment of both sides. And that's something that we've talked about in terms of what defines academic writing. Harris then also points out that in so doing, in dealing with other writers, your aim should be less to prove them right or wrong, correct or mistaken, than to assess both the uses and limits of their work. Harris calls his readers intellectuals, encouraging his writing students to think like intellectuals, avoiding simplistic ideas, broad oppositions and arguments, or polemic. In other words, an intellectual avoids making simple either it's this or it's that kind of arguments in favor of arguments that offer a more substantial look at opposing concepts and terms. So what does this have to do with assessing the uses and limits of a text? Harris suggests that we consider what the text does or sees well and what it stumbles over or occludes. There's some evaluation here, certainly, but it's an evaluation of the methods and materials of the text rather than an evaluation of the merits of the position. Or, as Harris concludes, in coming to terms with a text, you need not only restate its project, but also to take its measure. So by way of conclusion, this review of Joseph Harris's first chapter of Rewriting has, of course, been its own kind of summary, its own kind of rewriting. My aim here has been to represent Harris's text to help your understanding of his ideas and how they might be applied to your summary. Quick review then, Harris's major points are to define the project of the writer in your own terms, and for that he suggests that we consider the aims, methods, and materials, that we represent the author accurately, and that we make the author the actor or subject of our sentences in the composition of your summary. His second point, that we note keywords or passages in a text. He elaborates that by suggesting that we ask ourselves, what aspects of this text stand out for me as a reader? That's a process of our own comprehension, and then from our comprehension we select those keywords and passages. And that we use quotations as flashpoints. And then his final point is that we assess the uses and limits of the approach of the author, and we do that by considering where there is insight and blindness into the approach. So in your summary, you'll be asked to apply Harris's ideas to the assigned text, so be sure that you're comfortable with these concepts. And thank you very much for listening to this presentation.